Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, taking some time out to listen to us. The webinar series is starting today from Dufresne. We've got a four-part webinar series, so one webinar every week for the next 4 weeks, looking at various different subjects around BI and how businesses interact with them and some of the main challenging points. So the session today is brought by Dufresne. So myself and Megan, we're both going to be speaking today, both work for Dufresne. It's a UK data consultancy that look at all things to do with data, be it engineering, architecture, data strategy. But the area that myself and Megan are most excited about and interested in is the business intelligence analytics area. So before we kick into the content today, we'll just do a quick introduction of ourselves. So my name's Colin. I've worked at Dufresne for nearly 7 years now, but have a career of around 15 years looking at various different analytical projects. What I really enjoy is leveraging data to solve business problems and improve processes and get better outcomes for businesses. And my day-to-day role is to help Dufresne build that capability and our clients with implementing solutions that do that for them. Over to you, Megan.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Megan Lividas, co-head of BI and analytics here at Dufresne. I always joke that while we at Dufresne are technology agnostic, I'm not, I'm quite biased. I'm very much sat in the Microsoft world, specialising in Power BI. I've been doing Power BI implementations for about 6 years, and more recently Fabric. You'll often find me talking about Power BI enablement, so beyond the report building and more about how do we actually see the ROI from the reporting, how do we make sure it's well governed, the platforms are managed, and that people actually use them. I'm based just outside London, but originally from Glasgow. So yeah, that's me.
So just as a bit of a placement then for the webinar series, so already touched on it, there's going to be 4 different sessions. The session this week is around how we implement new BI platforms into a business and do that successfully and some of the challenges around that. The future episodes of the webinar then, so next week we're going to be looking around optimization of existing BI platforms. Week number 3 is going to be looking at governance and how we can implement governance processes to improve outcomes, improve adoption rates, those kind of things. And then the final series is going to be around migrating, so from one BI platform to another, why you might want to do that and how you do that successfully. Before we get stuck into today's content, then we do have a Q&A tool. So anyone who's got any questions throughout the conversation, if you want to raise those questions within the Q&A function, we will address those either throughout the course of the webinar if it's kind of relating to the content that we're dealing with at the point in time, but there's also a section at the end where we'll address any that are outstanding. And if we get so many that we can't deal with them, then we'll reach out to you after the webinar and get in contact directly. Right then, so key themes in terms of implementation of BI platforms then. So we're going to go through a little bit around why we would want to use a modern BI platform, what are the benefits. We're going to go into how we pick the right BI tool for a particular business or organization, what are the main considerations we might have around that. Then once we pick that tool, we're going to kind of go through the implementation lifecycle. So what are the main milestones that we want to consider, some of the decision points around each of those points in that journey, and some of the common pitfalls that we see when we're dealing with various organizations and how they've done it in the past. Then we're going to look at how we scale it and the ensuring return on investment once we've got it in place. Right, so let's get into it then. So why use a modern BI platform? So I guess if we go back a few years, there's probably quite often in my career, I've seen sort of people still running their reporting processes off things like Excel. They'll have centralized data teams that manage all of the reporting requirements. And quite often what you see is this cycle of periodic reporting where people are creating reports to a deadline, be that weekly, monthly, annually. And so much effort goes into producing reports to a deadline that actually a lot of the time that they could be using, understanding that data and deriving insights is all in that manual effort. It's lost that. So what people are having in those sort of prior to these platforms being available is all that additional friction, and it means that these businesses are less agile or able to react to emerging trends in their data. So their ability to take advantage of opportunities in the market or identify emerging risks within their data is minimized. Also, what we see is that when you have these prescriptive kind of PowerPoint decks that get put in front of our key stakeholders that you've managed to gather into a meeting room, they're at times very hard to get all in the same place at the same time, but you've got a bunch of infographics data on a page. And beyond that initial kind of layer of, okay, that's interesting, what's next? All that leads to is additional questions that get fed out into a centralized data team, again, get into a backlog of ad hoc queries, and then you're kind of into a big pipeline and delay. And that, again, just feeds into that idea of not being very agile or being able to react to information. So these more modern BI platforms that we're going to talk around today address a lot of those problems. So the automation of the data composition, having data that we're confident in, that is standardized, that the whole business can use, means that we don't have scenarios where people go to meetings and have different versions of numbers and get absorbed into a discussion around whose number's correct, rather than talking about sort of the things that are important to achieving our organizational goals. Also, by being able to empower our business users and getting the right information to them in a timely manner, this allows people to sort of use that information to make better decisions in a way that not having that information kind of leads to bad decisions that are contradictory to what we're trying to achieve as an organization.
Yeah. I think just to add to this, like you could be sitting here saying, why are we talking about why use BI in 2024? Like, isn't everyone there? And you'd be surprised that there are still organizations that we are onboarding to a BI tool for the first time. We're taking them off Excel, usually in the finance area. Finance teams, no matter how advanced the business is, we're kind of pulling finance along behind. But even for those organizations who have adopted a modern BI platform, I think it's so important to look at this and remember why. Very often we come into organizations that have been using a BI platform for years now, and it's just full of operational reporting. It's full of, just pages of numbers in a table with slicers, and people just treat it as a data portal. And we say, what do you like about Power BI? And they say, I can get my data out really quickly. And what do you mean get it out? Where are you going with it? What are you doing with it? It's so important to sit down and remember, why did we actually get this in the first place? It'd be a lot cheaper if you just want numbers on a page to have a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, right? It's really important to remind yourself, who are we trying to empower? What are we trying to do? And start with the questions. Start with what business questions we're trying to answer. We'll work our way through from there. And that's really the aim of today, is to talk about how do you get there, whether you're starting out from scratch, or how do you get back to that if actually you've gone really far into a BI build and find yourself just operationally calculating numbers.
Great. So once you've decided that you would like to explore the possibility of having a modern BI platform, the first thing to do is decide which tool it is that you're going to pick. So quite a lot of pitfalls here, but as a starting point, what we'd recommend to do is kind of go and look at the Gartner Magic Quadrant. So this is a document that's produced by Gartner every year. It's normally in the first quarter of the year. And this looks at all of the tools that are available in the BI analytics space in the marketplace. And this will list out key considerations around the completeness of vision. So that is, what type of functionality does it have, and then the next piece is like, how well does it deliver that functionality? And what we can see in the infographic from the 2024 version is that we have leaders at the top here. So we've got Microsoft, which is Power BI typically, although there are other analytical facets to the Microsoft offering, and Tableau, which is now owned by Salesforce. And I think, within that document, there's a long Word document that comes along with it and gives you those kind of key strengths and weaknesses of each of those tools. And by understanding sort of how you want to use the tool and how your users are going to use that, then reading through that should then help kind of inform your decision. So I guess anyone who's got exposure to some of these tools like Power BI and Tableau, that's kind of one way in which these tools kind of offer insights, that kind of semi-prescriptive canvas that you have your infographics and your visualizations on on the report there that are interactive, but then there's other things around natural language querying that looks a little bit more like a Google search engine, those types of things. So understanding that need for insights being fed to a team or people who want to explore their data in a more self-service way, and having a bit of a vision around how you would like that to look for your business will really help you make that decision. And again, for anyone who thinks it's a bit over-facing, then obviously reaching out to sort of SMEs or people who have experience of the technology is probably a good place to start. One of the big things we do tend to find, though, is where BI functions have kind of organically grown without a sort of starting strategy point, where they'll have hired a member of staff who has experience with one of these tools, and then that becomes the sort of de facto tool for the department because it's easy to let that person run away and go and deliver what they know how to do. That isn't always necessarily the best way to go, in that what's right for that one person might not necessarily be the best thing for the organization. So word of caution there for sure.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you're going to go next into a bit more of the principles behind how you choose your tool, right? But I think key commentary from me on this would be, we're talking about tooling first because it's probably one of the first things that comes up, right? Anytime we're talking to a client about a new BI implementation, it often comes down to the tooling. It's important to really consider that tooling is tooling. It's much more about which business problems am I trying to solve, how do I want to solve them, and what skill sets have I got. So yes, this conversation is important, but it is not the be all and end all. And the tooling is not really going to be the silver bullet to fix your problems. It's how you then use that tool. And we're going to talk a bit more on that later. But while we are on tooling, yeah, I think I can't stress enough, while some of these more niche players or challengers, they could have a feature that is just so what you need for a very specific use case, you've got to weigh up how weighty that use case is. And sometimes it will be weighty enough. There are absolutely reasons these tools exist and can just be fantastic setups for your organization. I think for a lot of the larger organizations we work with, or even the more smaller ones, but who need that scale and flexibility in the market, going with one of these leaders in the market like Power BI, like Tableau, is just going to give you the access in the community to the right people and the right help. Whereas going with something a bit more niche, you might be so much more dependent on niche expertise at that, which then comes with a price tag. And I think that's one of the key things to weigh up here. But yeah, Colin, why don't you talk us through the wider considerations?
Yeah, we have just had a question come through around Tableau and Power BI. So the question here is, Tableau and Power BI are clearly the two standout tools in the market. What factors should a business consider if they're torn between the two? And I think actually you've had quite an interesting conversation around this recently with a client, haven't you, Megan? So maybe you want to answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a client who actually really quoted to us, and we felt it rang really true with a lot of what we see. And it's a lot of organizations are trying to work out where that balance of self-service is. You've got a central data team. How much do you want them to hold the key to BI, and how much do you want to give freedom to your business teams? Your analysts sat out in a business unit to self-serve. And I think this client felt that where you really want a federated business model and you want to empower people to access their data, Power BI can accommodate that a bit more flexibly. But where actually you really want to lock it down and have your self-service team really hold the keys to the BI tool, Power BI comes with a lot more overhead to lock down. There's a lot of governance involved. And I think that's a great thing. I think it's great that there's so much flexibility, but actually Tableau can just be a bit more suited, I think, to that central data team. So while there's a lot of considerations that come into it, such as alignment with the rest of your tech, such as licensing costs, to be able to sum it up as federated data model, Power BI, central data team, Tableau, I think is quite a nice way to look at it as well.
Yeah, and either which way you cut it, both of these tools do the basics of BI at scale very, very well. So unless you've got sort of very specific needs, then yeah, I think there's always a good place to start within just looking at those two and what they can do and how they might meet your needs. Okay, so wider considerations then around picking the right tool. So what are people looking at when they think which tool should we go for? So first consideration we tend to hear is, how much is this going to cost? And another kind of word of caution here, I guess, when you're going on your tool picking journey, a lot of these tools are very, very good at giving you a lot of the functionality for free. So this helps you build your business cases without having to spend any money. And you can start looking at how you might visualize, how's that going to use or how am I going to be able to um, create my use cases within the tool. The point at which you start having to spend money tends to be at the point where you want to start sharing this around your organization in a controlled way, and having all that security around it. So when it comes to pricing up how much the tool's going to cost, having an idea of how big your data is, how many users, how frequently those users are going to use it, they're the kind of considerations you're going to want to be able to have. And then when you're thinking about the cost of the tool, it's in the context of those factors rather than what's the cost of entry. And it's once I've scaled this up, what does that look like? And a lot of them start getting sort of, quite meaty numbers. Will it scale? So some of this stuff is addressed within the Gartner quadrant. So I've got an initial use case, it works really well. A lot of vendors and their demos, when they come around to you, they all work really rapidly, but it's all done on a very neat, very optimized data set and tells all the stories that you want. When it hits reality in big organizations and they've got sort of more clunky or bigger data or less clean data, it's like, will this kind of work in a way that people are going to use it? Once you start getting into like suboptimal performance with an organization and things start running slowly, people start not using the tool. So having a tool that's going to be able to scale and work at scale within your organization is super important. We're in a kind of culture now where people can have everything instantaneously in their day-to-day lives. Having to sort of sit and wait for a minute for a spinning wheel to go around on the screen is not a very satisfactory experience. And once people start not using the BI, all of the insights that can be provided to them, you get into the realm of guessing again, and obviously that's counterproductive and you're not getting the return on investment that you're hoping to have. Will it integrate? So everyone will have a technology landscape that exists already. You've got all your data source systems. Now, not all tools will integrate with all technologies. One of the things you might want to think about is how easy is it for a technology to integrate with what you have already in your landscape? It may be the case that you might have to introduce another layer of data platform between your existing source systems and your BI platform. If that's the case, then again, if cost is a factor, you might have to think about how much that data platform is going to cost. Does that increase complexity, or would you rather have a tool that is more kind of aligned to what you have within your organization? Do I have the skills? So as an organization, kind of touching back onto the comment on the previous slide, like you might pick a tool because one person has a skill, but how close or how easy is it going to be for the rest of your organization to pick up that technology? Now, generally with the right training, none of these tools are going to be massively complex to deal with from a business user consideration. But when you start getting into the developer world or the administration of platform, then there might be different coding languages or different types of networking or requirements that you need to kind of consider. Megan, jumping in.
Yeah, I'm just going to say we've had a question come in. So if implementing a BI tool is a big upskilling exercise, what does the training typically look like and how long does it take? Now, we will talk a bit later on about how to guarantee ROI, how to help that along, and we'll touch on this again there. But yeah, I think this is the key. Right from your tooling selection, training is the point of consideration. So if you are implementing a tool that is widely available in the market, chance that you are able to fill your BI team with people with that skill set much higher. Whereas when you go with some of these more niche ones, you're going to have to look for people with niche skills, which of course comes with a bit more expense. If you encounter a bug and you go on, let's say, Power BI forums, Tableau forums, chances that someone else has had that bug and posted in a forum and had an answer, much more likely than with something a bit more niche. And so that would be my advice. The wider you adopt the tool, the wider training materials that are available. But yeah, we'll kind of come back again to that a bit later on.
Yeah, and I guess pointing to sort of webinar 3 around governance, we'll do a lot of talking around profiling our people within an organization and how are they going to use the tool and then setting them up for success. So yeah, I guess if that's something that's of particular interest, then I'd recommend joining that session in a couple of weeks' time. Is it functional? So probably one of the main things that you want to look at probably should be first on the list, really, but does it do the thing that we need it to do as an organization? So looking at a BI tool, one of the key principles is what are the answers that we need what are the questions we need answers to? What business problems is it going to help us solve? And how do we want to do that? Is it going to be something around bar charts, line charts, time series, those kind of things? Most of these tools will have a version of that in place. If it's going to be more around real-time analytics or statistical stuff, then that's when you start getting into divergence of functionality between the different technologies. So if you've got, again, one of those kind of more niche use cases, then having a look at that and looking at the sort of profile of the technology is really useful early on to make sure you're not going down the track of a technology that might not be able to support your business needs. Okay, so we've looked at how to pick the right tool. The next step we're going to look at then are the implementation milestones. So we have a slide here that kind of touches on what we've kind of distilled down into still a relatively long list of 11 things. But all of them, I think, have interesting talking points around implementation of a BI tool. So yeah, Megan, do you want to kick off on this slide?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really the crux of it, right? I think what we often see with the implementation of a BI tool is we turn it on, especially when we're talking about things like Power BI. It's very common these days for you to have a Power BI licensing wrapped up in your Microsoft licensing model. And so it's kind of just there. And so we assign the licenses, we get moving. Someone somewhere that has a spreadsheet puts it in Power BI, and all of a sudden we find ourselves a year down the line with a tool that we've adopted almost by accident. I think we often see much less investment into the rollout of a BI tool than we would on other softwares. I mean, I remember at the start of the pandemic when Teams was being so widely rolled out, you had teams and teams of people, project managers, all really focused on what we have and how do we do this properly. It doesn't really happen in the BI world. So the starting point really is, what are my objectives? What do I want to achieve? Considering who you want to have the tool, do you want to have a federated data model in which people are encouraged to self-serve, or do you want something a bit more centralized where a BI team, I guess it's not fair to say the word dictates, but dictates the golden source of the truth to the rest of the business? And the starting point really is, well, where are we now? What do things look like? How much black market MI do we have, and which tools do we have? I think a very common scenario in which we find ourselves hurtling to roll out a BI tool is because we're actually trying to replace something else. Now, we are going to talk in a few weeks about migrations, because while an implementation of a tool and moving from one to another, there's a lot of common principles. There's really a lot to say about, well, why are you moving from one tool to another, and is that the right thing to do? So we'll really get into the crux of that there. But really taking the time to consider what you have now, what licensing exists, and which skill sets exist is going to be a big part of your roadmap. In particular, I find teams that have spent years working with Tableau, and you hand them a Power BI license, and say, it'll be the same, right? It's the same skill set. Absolutely not. In scenarios like that, what we often find is Power BI models that have been built with just one big wide table that's not performant, can't scale, inaccuracies, and it's because people haven't invested in that transition of people's skill sets. So really take the time to get into what you have now, and how you want to work towards the future. Now we've touched on tool selection, right? So at the point at which we've understood our problems and we understand what we have, that's a good time to now be talking about tooling. I think a common issue is that we start at point three. Someone somewhere gets a really great demo of a really great tool, or someone important happened to use something else sometime, and so this whole conversation starts with point three. I want to use this tool. If you find yourself in a conversation like that, really important to walk it back and talk about, why do we want it, and why can we not use what we have now? From there, I guess that's where we get into the exciting bit, right? The planning and the designing. Now, I just want to touch on, we had a question come in. Implementing a BI tool is a big decision. How can I convince people in the business that it's the right thing to do and bring them along in the journey? And I would say this is the real key to that step. Planning what your BI implementation is going to look like and designing your roadmap before you get into plugging anything in and turning anything on. And it's all got to be tied back to the objectives. Are you doing this to improve productivity? Is it because people spend too long doing manual things and you want to cut that down? Is it because you're not getting the right insight? You know, is everything very historic looking and you're not really doing anything forward looking? And yeah, taking that time to consider what you want to achieve from BI tool. And at the end of the day, what's the pound sign? What's the value? What value are you going to realize as a business by spending this amount? That's often going to be what's going to get you that budget and help you convince the business that it is the right thing to do. And being really upfront about how much work is going to need to go in to the rollout of that tool, it can be the crux of that. I guess, Colin, anything you want to add there in terms of how you put that roadmap together?
Well, I guess the roadmaps are often dictated by other pressures within a business as well, aren't they? So if there's milestones or things that you need to hit, then yeah, it's how do you flexibly accommodate those things within an organization to make sure that your wider business strategy is also accommodated. That can sometimes be a case of let's throw more people at it and try and develop in parallel those kind of things, but that's not always necessarily the right thing to do. I think where you've got the opportunity to start small, figure out how we're going to deliver things the right way, refine our processes as we go. I think when we get into initial objectives and when we look at requirements initially, by the time you get to the end of a project or once you put a product or a set of reports in front of a series of stakeholders, those requirements very quickly change because that initial question or requirement isn't really the problem that they're trying to solve. It's the what happens when we see this happen within the data. What's the secondary question? That's the really interesting thing generally. So I think, yeah, figure out what works well for your business, how to roll it out, get some really good, robust processes in place, and then incrementally roll that out throughout your organization tends to be the way that these projects work well when we've seen them done.
Yeah. Now, I'm just going to look back to a question that's came in around data storage. So, does where my data is stored impact the choice? If I'm a Google Cloud house, would they be a better choice? So, of course, Power BI and Tableau, I mean, we hone in on those two market leaders, right? They both have connectors to so many of your sources. So Power BI, yes, absolutely can plug into GCP. Tableau is absolutely going to work well with it. I think sometimes where we see Power BI rollouts in a Google house be a bit tricky is the lack of Entra sort of integration. I think with a lot of Power BI advice, it's having Entra groups, having AD groups, being able to manage your licensing that way. And so for some Google houses, Power BI can feel like a little bit of an extra overhead to manage the licensing and the intra groups, AD groups, where in other Microsoft houses, those groups already exist. It's just an extra part of your joiners, movers, leavers process, and that all gets swept up. So Power BI can still be the best choice for a Google house, but as long as you've just considered that extra IT overhead. Another point of consideration is your tech. If you are an organization that all has MacBooks, well, do you have virtual machines on the MacBooks? Because Power BI Desktop not available on Macs. So then you're forced to sort of spin up Windows environments in your Macs to work with Power BI. Now, is that always going to be the case? Not sure. The more that we see Fabric develop, I think the less reliance there is on desktop for Power BI. But at this point in time, that is still a consideration. Just kind of darting back to the tool selection there while I've seen that question. But yeah, at that point, really, we talk about installing and configuring. And so, yeah, I think this is often, as we've touched on, the bit that gets skipped. Rarely do we see an organization taking the time to pause and actually install a BI tool, configure a BI tool. It kind of just happens accidentally. And we want to talk a bit more about this when we talk governance in a couple of weeks. But yes, Power BI specifically, you've got so many tenant settings to consider that out of the box might not be suitable. Let's consider things like publish to web. And so taking the time to assess the tool, configure it that suits your business needs, and we'll talk more in 2 weeks about the right way to do that for your organisation, is a key step of this before you get ready to deploy. I guess on integration and preparation, Colin, what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, so once you've got your BI tool in place, then there's a whole suite of activities that need to happen in terms of connecting to your data, getting your data into your BI platform, modeling it in an optimal way for it to work for your BI tool. So depending on which tool you've selected, there's going to be different considerations around how do I prepare that information to make it run and deliver insights in the quickest way possible. this is an area that's very easy to get wrong in terms of data preparation, and in terms of how we'll be talking about optimization next week, and where all of the processing should be done in terms of the data journey from source to insights. But yeah, making sure that you're putting as little overhead as possible onto that BI tool and leaving it to do the sort of surfacing of the insights rather than the processing is probably one of the main things that we'll be talking about there. And then once that's kind of in a state that everyone's kind of happy with, and you've kind of got that as your golden source of information, you can then kind of move on to the development of BI artifacts. So this is where you're taking your requirements that we've sort of talked about in your sort of objectives in phase one and turning them into something visual, and that sort of front end product that your business users are starting to see and derive insights from. And that'll be done iteratively and from a use case level. And once you've built that out, you'll start to then look at testing and validation. And what I'd say is that development phase should actually involve a lot of interaction with your business users. That testing shouldn't be the first time that your business users see what you're building out. Like I alluded to earlier, is that those requirements will evolve over time, and the second that you put a report or a data visualization in front of someone, that's when you'll start getting to what they really want to see, or they'll go, oh, now I've seen that, I'm thinking it would be better if we had this on it, this on it, and this on it. So rather than getting to your testing and validation phase after a 2-week sprint, 4 weeks of sprints, and then getting all of that surface to you at the end of that point in time, I would have a very collaborative way of working with your business users where you have regular touch points, even where possible. I know this doesn't happen as often anymore, but if you were in an office and you could work side by side and have that kind of almost, what do you think about this, on when you're getting a coffee sort of thing, that worked really, really well. That's a lot harder to do in a more remote world. But sort of baking time in on a day-to-day basis to sort of review progress, what's going on. Does this look and feel right to you? How would you navigate through this? And does this give you the insight that you need? Is probably the best way to go.
For sure. And it's so important to just put yourself in the shoes of the user. I think as a developer, we often assume things are just going to be known, take them for granted. I mean, in Power BI, drilling up and drilling down, to us, we get that drill through easy. But if you're a user seeing this for the first time, you got about 4 arrows on the screen above each visual. How do I know which one's which? It can feel quite intimidating. I mean, a slicer visual versus a filter pane. There's about 4 different options: basic, advanced, relative. How am I supposed to know that? So taking time to sit with the users and actually walk them through the basics is so crucial to actually seeing adoption. I can't explain how many times I've seen reporting rolled out and 6 months later you check in and you do that review step and people aren't using it. The usage metrics aren't there. Even though it's got everything they need, it's all this great insight, and you go, why are people not using it? Because you're maybe taking for granted how accessible it really is. So take the time with any BI implementation to sit with the users, invest in their adoption of the tool, and that's really the key to making sure you're going to get the adoption of these tools.
Yeah, and I think the concepts of having champions and communities within organizations is something that's often overlooked. So very early on when we're implementing a BI tool, we'll try and identify a few sort of more enthusiastic members of staff within an organization and try and really kind of sort of jump onto those people and keep them very close to the implementation and get them sort of interacting with everything that we're doing. And what we tend to find then is as they disperse into the organization, they're then kind of promoting that tool and driving adoption and engagement with the tool as well. And setting up just chat forums and places where people can go and show what they've done and share best practice or ideas or ask questions if they're struggling with something. All of that sort of relatively simple stuff to do often gets overlooked, and creating that just helps no end. So would recommend kind of having that as part of any strategy when we're looking to implement tools.
Yeah, I guess just before we move on to kind of close off on ROI and how do we ensure this, there's been a really great question come in about shouldn't BI be part of a larger data and governance plan for organizations rather than isolated silo? I could probably talk for half an hour just about this, to be honest. We'll come back to this a bit more when we talk governance in 2 weeks. But just to address it for now, I think that where I see BI governance wrapped up as part of a wider data governance strategy, it often misses that nuance of the expertise that's needed for the tool. So your bigger data governance initiatives can be often about who should see which data, how sensitive it is, how is it being managed. And we often see loads of effort going into that, as it should, but missing really key parts like Power BI. There's going to be a tenant setting update every month. Every month there's something new. Copilot. Copilot went generally available in May. Organizations that have a Power BI premium capacity from May all of a sudden had this whole new feature that if your data governance people aren't tapped into the lifeblood of BI and what's happening every month, which I don't blame them for not being, how are they going to know to address that? How are they going to know the right workspace setups and access management? So to me, BI really needs its own governance focus, which should absolutely be joined up with a wider governance program. But should it be an isolated silo? Well, when you put your BI teams here and your engineering teams here and the wider sort of data world elsewhere, yes, that silo is going to come back to bite you. And so I guess the summary to that is your BI people need to be absolutely collaborating with a governance team, with an engineering team. They need to be able to all talk to each other, but put the focus on the expertise that's really needed for a BI tool rather than assuming that these people are going to get it or these people are going to get it. And that's, I'd say, how to get that balance.
And then I guess putting a slightly different lens on it and taking the governance away from it and actually sort of the delivery and technical functionality. A lot of organizations we see go from we want to have a bunch of insights. So our ultimate aspiration is to have a BI tool. What we're going to do first is we're going to implement a data platform. So we'll put in a load of data engineering in place. We'll create our data lake. We'll create our gold layer, reporting layer. And then what we'll do is we'll have a second round of change with a separate budget. We'll bring in our BI guys to then consume that and build the reports. And I can kind of understand how a lot of organizations end up in that because that's too smaller overall budgetary numbers. It's probably easier to get signed off. I can see the sort of sequencing of that happening. But what we then find is that because that nuance around how you model data for one tool compared to another hasn't been considered, or actually the requirements change over time. The second that we start putting our reporting in front of clients, that separation and distinction between sort of data engineering, data platform build, and BI implementation becomes quite a big problem in that if you've already got rid of the group of people who have implemented your data platform, you don't have the ability to change anything there if that's required. Or if you do, I mean, even if you do, it's just a bunch of technical debt that you're having to remediate anyway. So there's a load of wasted time and effort and costs there that could have been avoided if actually you had some sort of BI expertise up front when we're talking about the deployment and development of our data platform as part of that conversation. So when we go as Dufresne into like clients and we're owning data platform build, BI implementation, we'll always have a degree of BI advisory up front to kind of help shape that data platform build and support and minimize that amount of change that has to happen. But yeah, another common pitfall that we see fairly regularly. Okay, so now we'll move on to once we've implemented our tool, how do we ensure our ROI? So we're making sure that we've had a load of aspirations before we selected the tool, we've then implemented it. How do we sort of measure success and make sure that we've done this correctly and getting the value out of it? So once we see then like growing user demand, so if you're not governing your platform, so Megan's kind of touched on this a few times, what you start to see is that all of those kind of key best practice principles of single version of the truth, things that run very well, they start to slowly but surely get worse over time. And when we start having sort of suboptimal performance, or people don't trust the platform, or risks start to emerge because of security issues that haven't been held, then engagement into that platform starts to also reduce. And then a BI tool that's implemented that no one's using isn't delivering any value. So we want to avoid that from happening. Sticky plaster BI, so where people kind of either revert back to the previous ways of working and kind of circumnavigate all of that security that you've kind of labored whilst you've been implementing your BI tool, and people are circumnavigating that. You want to avoid that from happening. You might also have people just extracting data from your BI platform and just doing things on the side that you're not aware of. That's where I think like a really robust monitoring tool that sits over the top of your BI platform really starts adding value. Now, we don't think that there's any scenario where people shouldn't do stuff in Excel if that helps them and that's what they're used to. Again, kind of pointing at the finance people, but at least understanding how people are using your tool. If they're not using it in the way that was intended, being able to go and ask them what about that tool isn't working for them, or is it a case that they just need a bit more training or support, then I think that's being able to identify that's really, really useful.
One of my favorite things to do is if you've got a really good Power BI monitoring tool, if you've used the REST APIs, got your data out and you have your custom window to that, you can look at who is exporting in Excel versus who's analyzing in Excel. And someone exporting means they are starting in Power BI, pulling out. Great to sit down with those people and say, talk me through it. What do you do? What do you transform? What decisions are you making? What levers are you pulling with that info? And 9 times out of 10, there's going to be something you can do for them in Power BI that's going to have to save them time. But in those scenarios where Excel really is the platform, they need to massage numbers, they need to model, forecast, teaching them to start in Excel and connect to Power BI so that they're analysing in Excel with a central data model rather than having to start in it Power BI and pull out, much more efficient. Meaning that when they've got their Excel all set up, they're doing what they need to do, they can just refresh and it's going to refresh from the golden source. And I think it just helps with that adoption. It helps move them a little bit closer to a BI platform and get familiar with the fields, for sure. And yeah, questions just came in on that. So shouldn't a certain level of Excel explosion be expected? Yeah, absolutely. I think Excel can be a bit of a dirty word in a lot of BI worlds. It's like our enemy. But it's just not something you can take from people. It's a journey. If I need to model if number goes up, number goes down, what I want to happen, is Excel sometimes the best place for that? Sure. But it's about modeling the behavior. So getting people in Excel connecting to a central data source like a Power BI model means that they're connected to one version of a truth rather than plucking their own numbers up themselves. If people are exporting all the time, then they're going to have to repeat that every time. You're losing that efficiency that you brought the BI tool in to deliver. And so by letting them have Excel connected to a model, it's refreshing, they're hooked into the one version of the truth that you're trying to maintain.
Yeah, and I think if there is a repeated pattern of that happening and someone is running a process over and over again, then it's how do we create the asset within our automated BI platform that removes that need to do that, and then you're less likely to have new processes or new versions of numbers that emerge within your business, and it's just another source of potential divergence over time. The opportunity for manual error to kind of creep its way in. So yeah, it's all around kind of restricting those kind of scenarios from happening. Yeah, and also sort of optimization. So ongoing requirement to make sure that as more people are using the platform, as it's being used differently, as new assets get added to the platform, just making sure that we're keeping an eye on what that's doing in terms of performance and making sure that that's delivering insights in the timely manner that we want to see. So yeah, I guess all of those points that are on the slide there kind of touch to or speak to some of the key themes of the webinars that we're going to be talking through over the next few weeks. So the idea of governance, training, monitoring, optimization. So yeah, we'll be going into some of these themes in a bit more detail over the course of the next few weeks. So yeah, if you want that, then please join. So final slide then that we have before we move to any additional questions is the key learnings. So those guiding principles that we talk about. So what are the key questions your business needs answering? That should always be kind of one of the guiding principles of everything that you're doing. What we see is a lot of development for development's sake or functionality or throwing things at a page because it's good to have there. It's not necessarily the way forward. It's like, is this helping me solve the business problems that I've aspired to answer by implementing this tool? And also having the people at the center of everything that we're developing. So once we've got the answers there, is it feeding the data and insight to the people in a way that's going to help them perform and thrive in their roles? So is it making our people's lives easier, or is it making our people more able to deliver their roles successfully within the organization? Common mistakes that we kind of touched on. So not having a clear strategy in terms of your implementation journey. So people procuring a load of licenses or just switching on a tool and it kind of proliferating organically. We see this happening all the time. When we're implementing technology in other areas of our organization, we always have a strategy up front and plan it meticulously and roll it out incrementally and make sure that everything's really controlled. It's not always the way in BI. That idea of implementing a huge round of change where we've got platforms being built and not considering the BI requirements in its earliest inception, again, bakes in a load of technical debt, overhead cost that we want to avoid. So stay clear of that. And often not picking the right tool for the job. So by not having clear goals and objectives up front and just going through that idea of someone's seen this tool, they liked it, and then using that as our steer as to which tool we should be going through and proliferating for our organization, then that can lead us to make bad decisions, which might then lead to a migration project in the future or just low engagement, just a cost on your book that's not delivering any value. Right, so that's all of the content then. So we've got time for Q&A. Have we got any more questions in the pipeline there, Megan?
Yeah, so we've had a new question just come in there. So which parts of the journey do Frame typically own versus help the client build or use their own team? Very good question. And the answer is a real blend. Sometimes we'll have organizations that really just want something quick. They want to see value and they want to see it quickly. And they know that by bringing in a Dufresne team, they're going to get that, right? So we'll rely on our data engineering practice, our architecture practice to come in. We can spin up data platforms very quickly, and our BI teams are then able to deliver results really fast. So in as little as a month, we can have a data platform live. We have some reporting engagements that we do in as little as 10 weeks. But then other times the aim is less about I want value now and more about I want to transfer knowledge. I want experts to come in and I want to invest in my people. And where that's the key, where that's the kind of key objective, yeah, we're absolutely used to working like that as well. So we'll get right in, set in a team. We will take more scientific approaches so that rather than let's hurtle towards results, such as let's say we want to optimize something you've got, rather than taking a small slice that we deliver quickly, we start at the back and work through each problem and sort of take the team on a real journey with us instead. So yeah, typically I think as consultants, we're used to being quite flexible about what the objectives are for the client. Do you want to see results or do you want to transfer knowledge? Sometimes it's a bit of both. And so yeah, we'll do that as well. We'll get you results, but then at the end, we'll really show you how we did it. We do training. Our handovers are very much a kind of open book, and we'll let you know why we took certain approaches. But yeah, that's a real key part of the journey for us. And my favourite way to work, to be honest, is when we get to really sit in a team, share our knowledge with them, and pass it off. I've worked with loads of great analysts over the years who have become real Power BI aficionados, and that's always fun to see.
And yeah, I mean, outside of that, there are some companies or organizations where actually the overhead of managing and maintaining a BI platform isn't something that they want to have on their books. So there are instances where actually we'll implement a tool technology and all of their administration and monitoring will kind of have a managed service for that. So there are instances where we can own that infrastructure for a client if that's something that suits them. But I would say that is probably a smaller part of what we do. Overall, it's more about empowering organizations to go off and do it themselves and do it well and avoid a lot of the problems that we see if it's kind of done organically or people are doing it, learning whilst they're doing it. So yeah, that's probably a good summary of where we tend to help our clients.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think that's probably time on the webinar today. If there's any additional questions from anyone after the webinar, then please feel free to reach out. We have obviously we've got our optimization webinar next week, followed by governance and migration. So if you found this useful, hopefully you did, feel free to sort of sign up and join. We'd like to see you there, and we'll go through once you've got a BI platform in place and it's not working quite how you would hope, what are the things you can do to kind of get it to a stage where it's delivering the value that, and we start seeing that engagement again. And yeah, if you wanted to contact us, then Obviously, we've got an email address. You can follow us on LinkedIn, where you'll start seeing we've got a series of blogs that are accompanying these webinars. So sort of a few days before every one of these webinars, there's sort of a long form blog that you can kind of read and get your mind in the right space to hear us talk about it on the webinars each week. And yeah, keep updated by sort of following us on the website as well. But yes, the recording, this webinar's been recorded. We'll make sure that everyone's got access to that following this session. And like I say, any questions that you have following this, then feel free to reach out to either myself or Megan directly or through any of these channels, and we will discuss any questions that you have. So thank you from me.
Yeah, thank you for choosing to spend your lunchtime with us, and hopefully we'll see you more over the next couple of weeks. Bye, everyone.